Hi everyone, and welcome to a brand new tutorial. This month you guys voted for a tutorial about lighting, so this video will be all about various lighting techniques, how to create an interesting lighting setup, and there's going to be a lot of drawing, so let's go ahead and dive into this video. Before we get started, let's take a look at what we're going to be covering in this tutorial. First, we're going to analyze some photos and references to get an overview of some essential components of lighting. Then we're going to see how light can create an interesting composition. Then we're going to look at the importance of contrasting light and shadow. And then we're going to take a look at how light can be used to create a focal point in your art. After that, we'll dive into some drawing demos to show you some of my favorite lighting techniques. And then finally, I'll be leading you through the in-depth process of how I add light and shadow to two different drawings to apply what we've learned in the video. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to emphasize is the importance of contrast when it comes to lighting. And by contrast, what I mean is having a mix of strong dark tones and strong light tones right next to each other. So in this reference, you can see there's a very dark background while the model is standing in the sunlight, making her very bright by comparison, and so our eyes immediately go to her while the background doesn't grab our attention as much. And here you can see I tried to create a similar effect in my coffee shop drawing, where the background is very dark and the character is much brighter, which causes the background to be undistracting and focuses all the attention on the character's details. So in these other artworks, you can see that using strong contrasts in a light setup can help to create emphasis, and it makes our eyes go to a particular area. The lighting in each of these drawings isn't overworked either, and it's actually fairly minimal. So if you look closely, you can see that there is much more shadow and darkness than light. So the light is actually very simplistic, and not much of it is needed in order to create a dramatic effect. Okay, now let's take a brief look at how light can help create a dynamic composition. So in case some of you don't really understand what composition is or what it does for a drawing, it's basically how your drawing or the subject matter in your drawing interacts with the space around it. The composition is impacted based on where you choose to place certain objects within the rectangle of the canvas. So for example, a composition can look a little too balanced or uninteresting if the objects in your drawing are super symmetrical. Whereas a drawing with asymmetry can add visual interest and create a flow that carries your eye across the whole drawing. When it comes to creating a dynamic composition and avoiding a stiff one, I've found that it helps to have something in the drawing moving in a diagonal pattern across the canvas. So even though the stick figure in this drawing is completely centered and vertical and lacking any movement at all, it looks just a little more interesting because the circles in the background are breaking up that imaginary vertical line of the central figure with some diagonal movement across the space. And I mean, it's not actually interesting because it's just a stick figure, but you get the idea. It just looks more dynamic. In contrast though, you can see that if I arrange the circles in a more vertical and regular pattern behind the stick figure, it still looks stiff and it doesn't add any movement to the drawing. It lacks a dynamic feel. So this is a super basic intro to composition, and there's so much more I could say about it, but let's apply this basic knowledge to some lighting setups now. So in each of these references, the models are all placed pretty centered and vertical within the rectangle of the photo, kind of like the stick figure in my previous doodle examples. So by themselves, they're not very dynamic. But if you look at how the light and shadow is interacting with the space, there's suddenly a much more visually dynamic and interesting look to the space that creates that special asymmetrical balance to the composition. And this is something that I see in art all the time when it comes to lighting, because it's just a great way to break up any stiffness or vertical aspect in the drawing and add a subtle dynamic flair. Okay, now let's take a quick moment to just briefly observe how lighting can also help create a focal point. And again, just in case you're not sure what a focal point is, this is just a really basic example, but a focal point is basically an area in the drawing that stands apart from the rest. It's supposed to really capture our attention and really draw our eyes to that area. So in these examples, each model has a complex background behind them, which could be distracting normally, but here you can see that the lighting creates a focal point on their faces because it's making their faces the brightest part of the photo. And our eyes naturally gravitate towards brightness, so using lighting in bright areas is a great way to create emphasis and a focal point. We see this in art all the time as well, where there's a single bright area on a drawing that's meant to grab your attention and make you look at that one area of the drawing. So light can be used as a bold visual statement. And once again, you can see that it's not a lot of light that's needed, and it can be very minimal yet super effective. So now that we've got some basic knowledge about how light can impact a drawing, let's go over some light techniques and then we'll dive into some drawing. So before we get into some light techniques, I want to quickly show you my 3 favorite layer modes for adding light. And they are overlay, soft light, and hard light. And they're all pretty similar, but there are some subtle differences. Overlay is probably the brightest and most intense when you use it, and usually I don't use a very bright color when I paint with it because it gets so bright super quickly and can turn the colors underneath it kind of white. So to preserve the colors, I usually have to pick a deeper shade to get a richer color effect. Soft light is much more muted than overlay, and it's a little less transparent. It's nice for creating sort of a hazy glow effect that's really soft and not super bright if you want to create a more gentle light. Hard light is my favorite to use for almost everything because it's kind of the perfect mix between overlay and soft light. It can get really intense like overlay, but it can also be really soft like soft light. And it works amazing for skin, which you'll get to see in some drawing examples later in this video. So moving on, the first light technique I want to show you is how I draw rim light, and I'll be using hard light for this technique. Any brush will work for rim light, but I personally love using a brush that can create thick and thin lines in sort of a tapering effect, and I also like it if it has a bit of texture. My personal favorite right now for rim light is the Gouache Clean brush from Maxi Lichny's Gouache brush set. The thing that's important to remember when you're drawing rim light is line variation, so having a mix of thick lines and thin lines to create visual interest. And this also helps to create a flowing look to the lines. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how I usually add rim light to a drawing using a simple doodle of some oranges as an example. So like I said earlier, I start with a hard light layer to get a bright effect, and I'll usually start with a shade of yellow for the light because I can always change the shade later if I want to, and yellow is generally a good place to start if you want warm light. So as I sketch the rim light onto the edges of the oranges, you'll be able to see that for each one of them, I start with a thin line that gets thicker, or I start with a thick line that gets thinner. But I like having that thick and thin balance because it just looks more visually interesting. So I'll draw a line, and then you'll notice that I use my eraser to kind of erase away some parts of the line I just created and create a sharper and cleaner edge. It's kind of like sculpting the lines, and this way you don't have to keep drawing and redrawing the same line over and over because you can just draw it as sloppy as you want and then erase in a couple areas to make it cleaner. After all my rim light is in place, I'll go to my effects section and then go to bloom. You can use the layer option to make the rim light brighter, but sometimes it can look a little intense. So if that's the case, I'll go to the pencil option instead and use an airbrush to brush some brightness onto a few areas of the rim light. After that, another technique I like to do after I've drawn the rim light and made it brighter is to go into chromatic aberration and use the pencil option to lightly brush some of the effect over a few areas of the rim light, because I found that adding just a touch of chromatic aberration to a bright light source will help make it look even brighter and more intense while adding a subtle hint of color at the same time. And you can see that my method for adding chromatic aberration involves brushing onto one area, then tapping the screen to hit apply, and then continuing to brush and then hitting apply again, which allows me to diversify the chromatic aberration a little. So I know that bloom is a Procreate feature, and I'm not sure if something similar exists in other programs, but in case it doesn't, there's another glowy technique that has a similar effect to bloom, and it involves using Gaussian blur. So I'll use a hard light layer to draw my rim light just like before. Then once that's done, I'll duplicate the layer and then apply a little bit of Gaussian blur to the duplicated layer, which will create a brightened glowy effect. So this is a good alternative to bloom if you don't have that effect, and you can also use it in Procreate if you want to as well. Alright, so we've covered a lot of background information about lighting so far. Now let's apply what we've learned to a drawing. So this drawing that I'm starting with is an outdoor scene, and the reference has very muted lighting, but I want there to be a more dramatic contrast and intense lighting setup. So I've started out with just some simple base colors over my sketch and some minimal shadows. And usually before I add any light, I'll give the drawing a pass of shadows, because going back to what we talked about earlier, having contrast of shadows is essential if we want lighting to really stand out. So I'll add some soft shadows to the drawing on a multiply layer using a simple round brush so I can control the opacity. And the shadow color I'm using is just a light bluish gray. I don't want to use an actual gray tone because that can really take the life out of a drawing, so using a blue for some cool shadows will help maintain some of the life in the drawing while darkening the colors. So next, after I've added some of those shadows, I'll start to add some light onto the side of the face using a round brush and a hard light layer. I'm using a very bright light orange because I'm imagining a warm glow on her face to contrast the cool blues in the rest of the drawing. So I'm focusing on contrast like what we discussed earlier in this video, and I'm also thinking about how this light is going to be creating a focal point in the drawing because it's the brightest thing on the canvas, and that's what I want to happen. And just like what we observed in some other art examples, the lighting doesn't have to be super intense, and there doesn't need to be a lot of it on the canvas because otherwise it may overpower the drawing and lose its contrasting effect. So the lighting is very minimal in this case. You'll see me use bloom on her face just a little with an airbrush to make it softer and glowier as well. I added a little bit of light on the side of her jacket, and I'll be adding some rim light to her hair as well. And right now it looks very orange and pretty incomplete, but the key to this process is building up the layers of light gradually, which is a technique I learned from traditional painting, because if you want your painting to have depth and richness in the colors, you can't just add a single stroke of color and be done, because that just means it'll be lacking depth. So you usually have to start darker and gradually layer brighter colors on top of that to increase the richness and vibrancy. So because of that technique, my process can look really messy in the beginning, but it's okay to start messy and just take baby steps towards a more refined and clean product. So moving on, eventually I use a hard light layer and an airbrush to add a rosy light in the upper left corner because I wanted the light on her face and hair to look like it has a source somewhere off the canvas. And after that, I realized the hat needed to have some light cast on it as well, so I add that with a round brush and use my eraser to sculpt the color. Later in the process, I felt like the jacket was lacking some deep shadows and it all looked pretty light, so I used a round brush to start coloring some dark shapes of shadow under the folds of her hood to increase the contrast a bit more. And then I started to do the same thing in her hair as well because it looks very unrendered at this point. I have a really detailed hair tutorial video here on Patreon that you can watch if you'd like an in-depth walkthrough on how to render hair, and I'll include a link to that in the description of this video if you're interested in learning some tips and techniques. So here I just spent some time rendering the hair a bit to get it to a good spot. So after that, I felt like the color scheme of the character matched the shade of the background a little bit too much, like they were the same value almost. And just like what we talked about earlier in the video, it's really important if you're drawing a character with a background to have some contrast to help them stand apart somehow, whether that's making the character darker in value and the background is lighter, or the other way around. In this case, I got the idea of drawing a snowy background, so I decided to take a round brush and paint a layer of brightness over the background with a hard light layer, which I ended up really liking because it definitely helped the character stand out from the background a lot more than before. And then eventually I just used color balance to play around with the shade of the background color to determine if I wanted it to look more pinkish or bluish. So then I felt like the drawing was still missing something, and that's when I decided to add some snow. And there's literally a brush in Procreate called Driven Snow that I used for that, and it has a nice snowy texture to it, so I just used a hard light layer and a light blue to add the snowflakes. So now I'm just adding some final touches of rim light on the left side of the character to help her stand out even more from the background color, because they're both still fairly similar in value, and rim light is a great way to create a separation between a background color and the subject if they're close to being a similar shade. Finally, I wanted to add a warmer glow to the light on her face and hair, so I created an overlay layer and used an airbrush to very gently add some additional vibrancy to the colors. And that's it! That is a walkthrough of how I rendered the lighting for an outdoor character scene. Alright, now let's render a lighting setup for an indoor scene with a character. So in the last drawing, I very loosely followed the lighting of the reference and basically created my own lighting concept. So this time I'm going to follow the lighting of the reference more accurately so you guys can see how I would approach it. There's a soft, cool shadow passing over half of her body and face at a diagonal angle, which helps to create that special dynamic lighting setup like what we observed in some examples earlier in this video. And then there's a bright shape of light on the upper half of her face that creates a really lovely focal point. So I really want to try to replicate that. So first I'm using a round brush to shade that diagonal shadow across the canvas, and I started with a warmer hue for the shadow, but then I just painted over it with a cooler bluish gray because I want the cool shade of the shadow to contrast with the warm light on her face that we'll be painting later. So just like before, I'm starting with a pass of shadows over the drawing before adding any light. After adding the shadows, I'll create a hard light layer to begin adding that bright light on her face. And you'll get to see that I'm painting on a color and then erasing it and then changing the color and trying again. And that's because it usually takes a couple times for me to find the right shade for this kind of light since it's so golden but also kind of rosy and red. So it's good to just experiment until you find a shade that you're happy with. Once I find the right shade, I'll add a little stroke of light going across the canvas just because I think it looks cool. And yeah. The reference has some brighter accents of yellow highlights on her nose bridge and brow bone, so on the same layer I'll use my round brush to softly paint those highlights in place and then use my smudge brush to blend them out and make them softer. After that, I start to add some geometric shapes for the window behind her using a cool blue shade and hard light. And then using bloom in pencil mode was what I did after that to replicate the glowiness of the light coming through the window like what I see in the reference. So I continued rendering the background a little more after that, adjusting the shadows and such, and then I moved on to rendering her face a bit more. I felt like the shadow on the lower half of her face was a little dark, so I created a hard light layer and used a round brush on a lowered opacity to very lightly brighten the color just a little bit using a bright pink shade. After that, I made another hard light layer, I'm using so many hard light layers, to add some little highlights to her nose, upper lip, and chin, using a cool blue because if I used a yellow, it just wouldn't match with the blue shade of the shadow very well, so it's important to keep it cohesive. Alright, now it's time to add some rim light. I'm using a blue shade for the rim light because I'm imagining the light coming from the window behind her, touching her hair. And there isn't any rim light in the reference, but I feel like it adds a lovely mood to the lighting atmosphere in this drawing, so I'm adding it anyway. It also helps the side of her face stand out from the darkness of her hair, which is good too. So now I've reached a point in my drawing process where I've got some good shadows and light in place, but everything still looks pretty unrendered, so I'll just spend some time on a normal layer to flesh things out. This usually involves color picking shades on the canvas to add hair strands and add detail to the eyes, skin, and more. I spend a lot of time doing all the rendering in this phase, so I'll just let you guys watch the rest of the rendering process and then I'll talk again at the end of this video. Alright, so I'm almost done with this drawing and I'm adding some finishing touches, which is mainly just adding some chromatic aberration to the rim light on her hair to give it some extra intensity, and also adding a few additional hair strands to increase the detail. And that is how I would render the lighting setup on an indoor character scene, which brings us to the end of this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and had fun watching. I love creating helpful content for you guys, and this was so much fun. Thank you guys so much for being my patrons. It means the world to have you here with me on this little art journey. And yeah, I hope you all have a lovely and beautiful day. Bye bye!